Thanks so much for being here. I want to tell you first that I have an earache today, which is something that's pretty normal for me. That makes me think it's bacterial. Earaches are not contagious, but there can always be an underlying virus that can be contagious. I've made a COVID test. I don't have COVID. I feel very sure of that. Doesn't feel how COVID has felt in my body, as much as I can be sure of that. But I really welcome you to mask up if you don't feel comfortable, or take space, or if you want to go, that's totally fine. I'm not going to wear a mask for the talk, because that will really hinder communication. Yes, that's the first thing. So, hi, I'm Adri. I just did my PhD, and and my grandma said she was proud of me, and that's all I wanted out of it. But what feels really important for me is sharing the thinking I've been doing in the PhD with other performance people. And I think reading PhDs tends to be quite hard because you have to write them in a certain way, and also doesn't happen that much. So I wanted to both have this talk here, and also we're making a video audio document so that people can access the thinking in a different way. The written document is here, so you are welcome to, if it helps you to look at words or to look at the table of contents or something, you can do that. You're welcome to do that also while we're talking together. And what I'm going to try to do is not to give you a thorough academic argument as I've written it, but instead to try and give broad strokes around my argument overall as a way to enter. So maybe if you hear a part that you're very interested in, it could be something that you want to read more closely or talk with me about more closely. But also in doing that, I don't really know how to do it. I'm just going to try. If something is feeling confusing or you want to hear more about something, please feel welcome to raise your hand and interject at any moment. We can also chat after. We can have a proper question and answer time a bit if we want, or we can just have beers and chat. And yeah, I'm not going to show images because the work that I write about self-wounding in performance. So what might be called self-harm, when people make cuts, or for example, can we make a little pile of examples to start together of what self-wounding in performance, are there gestures you've heard about or seen in performances that might be considered self-wounding that you can think of? Scratching until the skin breaks, yeah, totally. Something else?
Cutting the body. Cutting of the body.
Cutting of the body, yep, with some kind of blade, or, yeah, like me.
Hitting the head against the wall till it's bleeding.
Hitting your head against the wall till it's bleeding, yeah. I know people who've gotten concussions like that too from performances. Also, whipping is a pretty common one. Punching yourself, yep. So there's this is to say it happens. We've established that self-wounding in performance occurs. How my research started was because I sometimes work with self-wounding in performance. Generally pretty small cuts, not super spectacular, not sprays of blood or something.
Why is it small?
I'm not going to talk about that because that's about my art practice, and I want to tell you about my research, but I will talk with you about that later. Thank you, Ali, sir. But what I noticed was that after the performances, I often got the same kinds of questions or concerned feedback from people. Are you okay? Do you feel all right? There was almost this feeling like I hadn't chosen to do this myself, really without, I think, any pressure from outside of myself, very little money or So I noticed that people were really concerned about me, but I also noticed that the conversation often stopped at that level. The rest of the work, maybe if we think about Helga's performance, maybe the cutting would be one gesture, like the water, the head in the water. And there's many other pieces of the performance that come about, and often this was wiped away when conversations about the work came up. I sort of became known as like a person who works with blood in her performances. And I was quite interested in this. So in thinking about these responses, I started to see a through line that I call pathologization. Pathologization is a way to name the framing of something as a problem for health. So it could be a physical behavior, it could be a mental phenomenon, but it's just to name that thing as a non-healthy or a problem for health thing. Pathologization. So this word is the core word that I follow through my thesis. And instead of asking a question which I think gets asked very often, which is, why do you hurt yourself in performance? This was also a big part of my experience, people asking me if I had a history of hurting myself outside of performance, and I really wondered about why these questions were coming up. So I focused my research on thinking about how people respond to self-wounding in performance. I'm not focused on why an artist does this, because I think there's as many answers to that as there are performances. And in doing that, asking about this response to self-wounding, there's a number of things I'm not doing that are quite important for the conversation to lay the ground. So, things that I'm not doing, as I said, are asking why the artist does this. I'm also not talking about self-wounding outside of performance, though I think there's many links we can make to the conversations. I also think that framing self-wounding as a public act, something that's entering into a public discourse, can do something importantly different. Okay?
Sorry, what do you mean?
I mean, so we have this figure of the teenage girl in her bedroom cutting herself, right? That's the classic self-wounding figure. And usually the narrative around this is she's internalized patriarchy, she doesn't know how to deal with the things, and so she's trying to calm her feelings or funnel her feelings, and this is how they're being expressed. And it's a psychological manifestation asking for help, right? This is the very classic narrative, which, by the way, statistically speaking, it's not the case that more young middle-class white women harm themselves than other people outside of performance. This is a total myth that we have. But this figure, if we keep this figure as a good talking point, I don't think it makes sense to ask the same questions of her as the performance artist who chooses to wound within their performance. Because I think that the framing of it is distinctly different and does something. Does that make sense?
Yeah, my question is, what does it do?
Yes.
We can't do it.
So I don't make an argument about what it does across the board, because I think that also self-wounding in performance does as many different things as there are performances. And however, I do make some arguments around this that I'll tell you about. But, okay. And the last two things that I want to sort of put off the table of the conversation are what I call the idea of common sense first. So there's a writer called Himani Banerjee who talks about common sense as the arguments that are more common being taken as truth over less common arguments, or for example, more academic arguments, etc., etc. So if we take as common sense, for example, I've very often in conversations, people are like, yeah, but if someone's cutting themselves, it's a problem, no? We should deal with this. I want to frame that as a common sense response and say, okay, this is what we're told in general, socially. But I think that if we go only with common sense, we might be missing something underneath. The second thing is gut reactions, this bodily response. You know, some people faint when they see blood. Some people you can get squeamish if you're watching kind of surgical performances. I mean, there can be very bodily responses, sweaty palms, racing heart. And I want to assert that I don't see a deeper moral truth under those responses. There's the great writing about folks who watched Ron Athey's work, who's like a very famous performance artist who's worked with blood and other self-harm, about people fainting in his works and then waking up and continuing to watch it. And those people stating, yeah, just because I fainted doesn't mean I want to leave. I want to be here. My body has this response. So I really resist taking the body response as something that holds a moral truth about blood being bad or something like this. Yeah? So now we've sort of like wiped the table clear. And I think the next question is, who gives a fuck? Like, why does this matter in any way? I'm super disinterested in talking about art for the sake of art or only in relation to art. And for me, the reason this matters is because, and this links to what you brought up, I think performance is a place where we can sense and perceive other ways of relating to each other, new ways of being together, of being bodies. And I think that that's how we build worlds. So all the laws we have are about governing a certain idea of a body, right? That your body is an individual body, it can be organized, it can have access to things or not. And performance is the place where I go to smell better futures. And if we are foreclosing the possibility of that smell, of that perception of better futures, I think we're doing a really strong political gesture that, in my opinion, is really unsupportable. So the reason that I'm interested in thinking about other ways of self-wounding in performance is because I think it can mean thinking about other ways of building worlds together and other ways of living together and politics together. So those are the stakes of why I'm interested in this. Does it feel like I'm being clear? Are we following? Okay, great. So this is the groundwork, and we're going to move into sort of 5 core chunks. And this talk, we want to keep it within a reasonable amount of time, not more than an hour for sure. So it will be swift. So in order to make this argument, I have to first show that pathologizing performance happens. If we remember, pathologizing is framing a gesture as a problem for health. So I look at a specific academic in order to do this, because it's much easier to look at writing and point out what's happening. And her name is Kristine Stiles. She's really important in performance art scholarship. She did a lot of great things for the field. She also really likes to apply the DSM and other diagnostic criteria to artists. And in doing that, she sometimes reads their work as if it's something that can be decoded, and she can discover, for example, a specific childhood trauma out of reading the work. So I look at this, and I start to think about, okay, what's happening? What's happening when the critic pathologizes the performance? So I see first that they're taking a position of a kind of a clinician, a doctor, which puts the artist in the position of a patient. This position is not a given. I mean, it's something that's being set up. And it also involves some ideas of the medical gaze, which has to do with power. So it creates a power imbalance within the reading of the work. I think also that we might ask, what's the problem to assume that we should look at trauma when we're reading a work of art? I don't think there's an inherent problem in this, but I do think doing so in this way can read the work as a sort of compulsion. Once the artist becomes a patient and is read as untransparently, or completely transparently one with their art practice, that there's no difference between the art and the artist, we also take away some things like the idea of skill or craft or perhaps like a complex intellectual process on the part of the artist. And they're sort of figured as this compulsive, traumatic figure who has a trauma and so needs to reenact it again and again and again until it's somehow healed. Ta-da!
Again and again and again.
Healed, no? And this, I think, is quite belittling of an art practice. If it's only trauma, some other things can get taken away in the reading. Yes?
I'm very chronology fixated. Could you help me just where you started to read
Yes.
self-harm on the time axis?
Mm-hmm.
Where this is becoming from your perspective important?
So self-harm as a thing.
In art, right?
In art. Okay, so self-harm in art then, because self-harm is culturally and contextually specific, how it's defined depends on the situation entirely. It's, I think, not totally possible to make a distinct limit, but I start my reading, so Stiles is dealing with a lot of the performance artists from the 60s and 70s, and a lot of American ones, or ones that are known in America. Yes. Is this helpful?
You differentiate between Western to Eastern, because in Eastern is like
So-
years and years, like
Absolutely.
thousands.
My discussion, because my discussion deals so much with, thank you for pointing this out. This is the another thing to wipe off the table is like, I am talking about the West. And by the West, I mean like this collection of countries that are generally richer, related to as the West, and have certain consistencies through them that are often about imperialism. So I mainly talk about like the US, Canada, the UK, because I'm talking also about healthcare, and there's certain histories that make sense to bring it through those, yeah? So the other thing is that I'm talking about reading the work in a certain way, and less about the work itself happening or not happening. Mm-hmm. Does this help with the chronology?
Well,
She's starting with 60s and
for
70s.
you, of the 60s, there are no other evidences that could be defined as before in the art world before.
Totally, there are. There definitely are, and I think there are in many genres. But I think it's in the 60s and 70s is where academic discourse starts really identifying and talking about that happening. But I don't think it's true at all that it's limited to that.
Okay.
But
Yeah.
was it the sprouts back then? Because like in the 60s and 70s, it was in general kind of a quellen, a sprout in general in performance art
Mm-hmm.
as a practice, as a legit practice of art.
Yes.
So and it was,
So is it stronger? Is there more self-wounding in the 60s and 70s?
It was so much like a self-oriented.
Yeah, I'm like very wary of these arguments because how we name self-wounding and where it's happening is so important to it that I think there's like a certain lens of art history that reads the 60s and 70s as a vastly more self-wounding time in performance. And this requires us to define what's performance art, whose art is being looked at and considered in this, and what's self-wounding. And I don't even find it an interesting conversation in a way. I think it's like...
For you, it's a theory that talks about it.
Yeah, it's like, okay, we can make different theories about this, but like, who cares? That's how I feel.
For you, the focus is what they wrote about it.
Yes, and then how ultimately what is written about it affects how we see it when we watch it. That's what I'm very interested in. Okay, so we scoot along. So, in Stiles' work, there's a very distinct way she writes that is trying to be helpful. I don't think she's trying to do harmful things. I think she's really trying to save these artists that she thinks are suffering. So for example, she writes she writes a specific piece that I look at about Orlan that you might know. It's a really well-known example. She has these surgical pieces in the 90s where she did a bunch of surgeries on herself, or she had people do surgeries on her, cosmetic surgeries of different kinds. And I think this impulse to help and save is really interesting. I call it the humanitarian impulse, this impulse to do good as a critic. And I want to point out that I think we should be wary of this for two main reasons. One is a kind of lineage of disability history that ends up in carceral care. Carceral care is the kinds of care that are more interested in controlling the subject than anything else. So you can think about kind of horror stories of folks with different sorts of disabilities being put into institutions and put under really brutal regimes. The other place where I see that the humanitarian impulse is really suspect is this historical lineage of imperialism, where, for example, in North America, missionaries were a really key component of colonization. And the missionary impulse is this kind of savior, kindness, support impulse that we've also seen do really, really great violence and harm. So I think when we see the critic or the witness being concerned, we should also check where that concern is coming from. Not where it's coming from, but what it can result in. Because I think when my family see me perform and they're concerned about me, it's because they love me and they want me to be well. But what are the results of that concern is a question. Because typically when I'm performing, I'm doing exactly what I want to do, more or less. So how do these concerns result in the end is a question on the table. We check the time. Okay. We're going to go a little bit abstract for a second and then come back a bit more concrete. So in this conversation on Orlan, Stiles gives this feminist reading where she says, like, Orlan is like that girl, the teenager in her bedroom. She is harming herself because she's internalized patriarchy and she's expressing her trauma hugely, and she was clearly sexually assaulted in her early life. There's also a person named Tanya Augsburg who gives a reading that she also calls feminist, but she reads Orlan's work very differently. She sees her work as resisting patriarchy, resisting the idea of the medicalized woman subject who's crazy. And I find really fascinating that, feminism, both things can be called feminism, result in super different readings. But both of those readings rely on the idea of self-possession. So in Stiles' reading, she's saying Orlan is not possessed of herself. She's possessed by patriarchy. Patriarchy is moving through her hands. If only she could be possessed of herself, she wouldn't harm herself. And Augsburg is saying, oh, no, Orlan is possessing herself by entering her own hands and enacting things that resist patriarchy. I say, it's interesting that the idea of the self is this, limited outline of the body, so that where my skin ends and Anya's skin ends, that's the end of the self, and that there's an idea of the possibility of possessing something there. So I start thinking about possession, and there's a very beautiful writer called Eileen Morton Robinson. She writes about how possession is an idea birthed from whiteness. So when I think about whiteness here, I'm thinking about a system of power that organizes things in very specific ways that do fall along and build on phenotype, on how someone looks, but also have other effects and organizational resonances. So that's to say, if we're thinking about feminism and empowerment as based in possession, I wonder if that means we're always thinking about a feminism embedded in whiteness that's doing whiteness. So I want to think about forms of resistance and other ways of understanding self-wounding that aren't based in the possibility of self-possession, one that's there and can be in charge of themselves, but something that understands a sort of interconnected way of being more strongly. Okay, I want to outline one more thing, and then we're going to kind of go through two nodes where we try to summarize some of the arguments around. It's very complicated to try and communicate to you 300 pages of thinking in broad strokes, but we do our best. So, okay, one, we've talked about how pathologization happens in this particular scholar's writing. I also look then at like newspaper articles that talk about self-wounding and performance. Just from the headlines, you can see they're also doing pathologization. And then I talk about like these experiences I've had of people asking questions after the performances. So I'm trying to say that pathologization is, I think, something that's really embedded socially in our culture. That it's the way we know how to perceive and make sense of self-wounding in these specific Western countries that I'm talking about on a social level. And also I want to make very clear that pathologization is, I think, profoundly ambivalent. To be pathologized can give someone access to really important things that they want and need. It can help someone's self-perception and where they place the blame. So the argument is not against pathologization in general. It can be really important if you're seeking a diagnosis for an experience to find that. And that needs to be honored and held. And its ambivalence is not, yes, this is not an anti-pathologization research project by any means. Okay, so I tried to make a sort of sum around these two lumps. And there's many things that are kind of key that I don't bring up because I think it's maybe more useful to make this sum and then to see if we have a sort of area we want to zoom in on a little bit or specific bits that aren't making sense for a few minutes, and then to like just talk together casually, have a drink, yeah? So the first lump is so we're asking about pathologization of self-wounding and performance. How is the artist understood when that happens? And the second lump is, what are the historical inheritances that come with that act? So we've talked about some of the things. We have like this question of where reading the artist as traumatic reads them as compulsive, putting them in this position of a patient. The medical gaze is coming up. When the medical gaze comes up, we have institutions coming up. Medical gaze doesn't just mean I'm a doctor and I'm looking at you. It means I'm a person who has institutions functioning with me so that I have the right to intervene in your life, your experience, your body. It also positions the doctor as this kind of healthy, normalized spot. And I think, especially in writing, this can, for example, with Stiles, often the reader is put in the same position, that suddenly the performer becomes this sort of unhealthy example. We have the history of the freak show that we can think of here, and therefore we can be assured of our own healthiness by contrast to theirs. Yeah? I think it's also, importantly, really much harder to see systemic issues at hand when we pathologize the individual body, especially through clinical taxonomies that are meant to do that. So we can't say like, wow, yeah, you're feeling really crazy because you've not been given access to basic resources that you need in order to survive. We just see like depression. Here's your diagnosis. Yeah, this kind of individualizing instead of seeing a larger system. And lastly, this flattening, making the art and the artist the same thing, treating Orlan's work as if it's her transparent psyche, which is a form of objectification, right? And when we're thinking of objectifying bodies, then we have to think of really violent histories that come with that, whose bodies get objectified and what that allows and doesn't allow. Historically, right, what are the histories that are coming up with this? We have ableism that's being enacted when we're doing pathologization. Very often there's a normal that's being supported, and this person, behavior is being painted as abnormal in contrast to it. We have this humanitarian impulse that we talked about. And then we have whiteness coming up through self-possession. And that also, this is a much longer part, but I just dropped a few dribbles, which is that there's also like self-mastery coming up with, that brings imperialism and colonialism in those ideas. The last thing that it brings up, the last two things that it brings up historically for me are capitalism's understanding of the body. So here I think with Silvia Federici, and her work is quite widely known, so if you know that, it might be helpful to think about the ways in which I think it's actually not helpful for me to go in depth in this now, but essentially these understandings of the bodies being necessary for capitalism come up when we pathologize artists. And lastly, this idea of personhood, which is something that I'm thinking about as if you picture a gingerbread cookie cutter. You have the dough, and you cut the figure, and you lift the cookie cutter away. For me, the cookie cutter is personhood. There's still a person here. There's no change to their complexity or their beingness, but this is the thing that the law looks at and says, sure, you have access to healthcare, or yes, you exist here, and therefore we will ensure you're housed, or so it's this kind of like legal figure, personhood, and that legal figure is, I think, what's really being defended and organized through pathologization at large. So by making someone crazy, naming them as crazy, you don't have to consider what their gestures or ways of being might mean for a new form of making a world together. Instead, they become organized within the system at hand and somewhat tend to be made ineffective. So I think that phenomenon is happening very often when performance is pathologized. I think now it would probably be most useful to see if there's like one or two spots that you actually want to hear about a bit more, because it's quite a lot. I mean, I maybe told you half of the things. Yeah, Ilka?
You said that, and you think that performance and being experience performance makes up maybe a positive new body and not personhood. Can you speak about the future of the positive body, which you had just in the beginning? And you know what I mean?
Kind of.
You spoke about worlds we create.
Mm-hmm. So you want to know about...
You said all the negative things about pathologization.
Yeah.
Your outcome of the research. What is the outcome of your research?
I mean, I think your question isn't asking about what the outcome is. I think you want the positive... You're kind of asking like about like the optimistic side or the thing that we miss if we use pathologization.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
This is what I meant.
I think, okay, maybe I've opened this because I think the smell is a bit strong, and I noticed people
It's because you're standing right above the egg.
above
Where
the
was.
smell, the egg.
The egg
No,
was-
I mean this smell, or maybe this is just because I'm standing near it. Oh, okay, never mind then.
Okay, I make it what is welding for you, because I just
Yeah.
know a little bit about your PhD, because I think maybe this is where I want to have more footage.
Yeah, I think maybe a concrete example would be the most useful for this. So, okay, what I love to think about is how quickly things change if one lays down in the street. On the sidewalk, you just lay down. You can imagine many different things happening, but one thing that most often happens, I think, is that something changes. Somehow, are you okay? Or maybe you're in the middle of a parade and the cops are like, hey, get up. Or the point is that as soon as you lay down on the street, you can see how much the street tells your body how to be. How many rules there are about what is the good way to be in the street here. And we're talking about streets like this, you know, we're talking about in these situations, in these social contexts. For me, that's what we can lose in performance. Because in performance, when you lay down on the street, instead of asking you if you're okay, which might be what I would do if I were walking down the street, I will usually choose to witness and consider you and your action. And this possibility has allowed me to, experience new ways of being together, to ask what kind of city would this be if we could rest in public with a sense of safety, for example. So this for me is both the risk and the beauty, hand in hand. Does it make a bit more sense with the concrete? Yeah, okay. Yeah. How are people feeling? Do we want to try zooming in on like another one or two spots, or are you feeling really full and we should close this and...
I have a question which might be a little basic, but...
Basic is great.
Basic is maybe... I was wondering, why do people do self-harm in the first place?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they are inside the framework that you were describing about self-harm being thought of as being pathological.
Totally.
So why do they do it? Because they know that it's going to be pathologized.
Interesting. I don't know.
Maybe you could give 1, 2 examples. I mean, from the 60s, maybe from now, from whatever.
Yes, totally. So the question was, why do artists do self-wounding when they know it'll be pathologized? And I think in a way the question is very apt because it says, like, hey, don't use that material if it's going to be pathologized. Maybe that's the way out of I find very interesting what my body is capable of. So I'm very interested in being able to make spit, being able to pee. And for me, when I work with blood, with my blood, I'm very interested in the fact that my body can manifest this liquid with this color and make these lines in space. I'm also interested in the possibilities of freedom that I feel. Because in performance I can do things that I would be potentially locked up for if I did on the street without framing it as performance. For me, the possibility to engage with my body freely without it being a psychological cry for help alone in my bedroom, and to make a visual and other perceptual image and beyond the image is why I've engaged with it. I don't think I can speak to other people's engagements with it because I think they're so varied and really depend on each work. But I want to resist just giving the power over to pathologization, saying well, if it's going to be called crazy, don't do it. Because then on a larger level, we're just going to organize society. It functions completely as a policing tool, right? Then well, don't protest because you're going to get sent to the asylum for it. Okay, well, then we don't protest anymore. I think the stakes of it are quite large. So I want to resist that. Does this make sense for you, in relation to your question?
Yes.
Yeah.
I have a lot more questions, but
We can talk more after, for sure. Yeah.
Maybe I can help him a
Yes,
little bit,
yes.
because I was looking at the same theme, and I was looking more from the question of the image. And a lot of artists that I was interviewing, they were saying, my body, my studio, like you said, I want to know about myself. And sometimes they used to open the body and try to find out what it looks like and what is happening. And others were also, even if some people hate to say that performance is also narrative, but some also wanted to tell stories and using self-harm as a story, but not a pathologized story, but a story from themselves. And that was something that I experienced in asking the artists.
That's super helpful, Helga. And you make me think about my favorite go-to argument, which is that if we were to say hey, don't do that which is pathologized, we would have a great problem for professional sports players who are doing work where they're very often getting harmed and they know it. Ballerinas, for example, we all know this image of the bleeding feet. Academics, boxing, and even on many levels you can think about nurses. I mean, nurses are running their bodies ragged to do their jobs. But we don't treat the result of that work as about the harm. We don't say, the ballerina is clearly dancing her trauma out. We say it's incidental because the technique requires it, right? So there's this idea that if the technique requires it, it's okay. Or, for example, with academics, it's pretty well documented that most academics develop mental health concerns by the time they get to higher education because of the demands and the way they're there. I know loads of people who get really major back problems from doing their degrees, right? That's a super common thing.
Those are, this is something we would call side effects, and let's say whatever.
Right, but we can call it a side effect.
10, 20 years of doing
Yes.
it, and
No, it's a fair...
When something happened and you're realizing your body's changing, this is one thing, but the other, you are just at the very core of it, you're changing your body. Just because you want to change your body, and not just because I was...
No, it's a great example.
Like what Chinese women, just all going, when they have all this, I don't know how it's called in English, when they were bounding...
Like historical foot binding stuff. Okay. So this is a great point because we can bring the question of tattoos right?
Yeah, but I would make a very big difference between
Why?
why?
I
Because
think
the
it's
one
hard to make
you
a difference.
mostly are not aware. I mean, I was also not
I
aware
know a difference.
how my body is changing because I was exposed to like the nurse.
No. That's
the
I
nurse
mean.
that you said that is carrying sick old people
Mhm.
for 20 years, and then after 20 years you
She
realize
notices
what you have
this.
been doing to yourself. In this very moment, you don't know what you're doing.
So you said the difference between those things is that in performance, that artist is taking a clear decision for bodily change, possibly. So then tattoos, I think, are a great comparison. Because with a tattoo, I would find it very hard to find a difference that matters between me making a small superficial cut and me getting a tattoo, right? But we treat them very differently. So the point is not what's right and what's wrong.
There's a public gesture, and the other person is not.
No, also tattoo is a public gesture.
I mean,
No,
honestly,
when you do it,
guys, this argument is bottomless. I know it so well. But I want to say that the thing of import is not what differences make a difference, because we can frame anything as self-harm or not. The point is that what is framed as self-harm is aesthetic and culturally specific, right? So we can argue anything this way, but aesthetics is a huge part of it. And I think that's very much why performance art gets pointed to as something, doing something unusual with self-harm, because the aesthetics can be more varied in the sense of like ballerina's toes. That's quite a specific narrow thing, but maybe like Helga smashes his head and I make a cut and there's some sort of wider berth there. Yeah? So this is what you wanted to say?
No, what I want to say is the question in general is very similar to, for me, the very Foucaultian understanding of the street is built in a certain way for you to behave in a certain way in the street, yeah, or a hospital or whatever, or society. And you touched it many times, or everybody asked here, what is self-harm? Because when you asked at the beginning, what is self-harm? Everybody talked about scratches and cutting, but self-harm, as you said, it's a ballerina, it's a performer that lift heavy things, it's intellectual that sits, and I think for me, I don't know how to put it into a question, but
no, it can be a comment.
What is the connection between this structuring of a certain way to live, a street, a hospital, Foucault, to what defined what is self-harm? And this is for me where the link is, like, it kept on showing here. I don't know how to form it into a question to you, because I'm sure you touched
I think that's super well said. I think that's you state my entire project really well in this sentence, because I don't think the only link between those two things is pathologization, but I think it's a really strong link. This link between how bodies are allowed to be and the institutions that organize them. I think pathologizing the body, naming it as sick, as crazy, as unwell, is one of the main tools that flow of power can happen. We are almost done the time that I want to give, but I know that you had your hand up. I don't know if you're still there for it, and I think we have space for one more if there's a burning, and maybe that's Susanna. So no, I mean like that two more, and then we close this like more formal part, and we just can hang out. And I would like, I'm down to talk about this for hours and hours and hours and forever, but I don't want to mobilize everybody's attention to do that at the same time. Yeah?
Yeah, I think I have more of a comment.
Yes.
It's like synthesizing what I'm hearing you saying.
Please.
It sounds like performance, like the medium of performance is behavior, or the realm of the social, for example. And it's just not useful to give psychology total domain over the social.
And the stakes are high. Like it's not, maybe it's useful for a very specific, I think if we know what we're doing when we're doing it, it could be very interesting.
Total domain.
Yes.
Performance can be an escape valve for that, and that's why we need in art criticism to not unthinkingly always use that way of seeing it.
Yeah.
Bro.
I think I totally connect to your thoughts in a way. When you just mentioned this being happening in the realm of aesthetics, and I was kind of thinking about relational aesthetics, because the one thing the two key things I think I learned from or understood from you today is, one thing is me as a spectator, or at times I'm a participant in a performance, I get the chance to witness in a very different way, to be in it, but also to watch, to pay attention, which I think in other circumstances I'm called for action or for opinion or whatever. Here I'm not. Also because I think it's a defined field. And I think the other thing is, you said at the very beginning, performance is about giving ourselves a space where we have a chance to explore our relationships. Interhuman, that's at least the way I know it. Maybe inter-life.
Inter and beyond human, yeah.
So I just thought, wow, this is quite interesting to have that space where I'm allowed to witness, or also embody and feel things that I usually institutionalize wise not permitted to witness, to feel, to sense, to observe.
Yeah, thanks.
Changing the behavior of the street.
Sorry.
Like changing the behavior on the street.
Yeah. And I think just to really consider, it's really hard to consider outside of common sense self-wounding that we witness. Because when we see blood, we're taught to think like emergency death, right? It's often this fear of death, which this is my next research about, like life and death being like a distinction of whiteness and an orientation of whiteness. That's maybe not that interesting. But now that we've had this talk, I wonder if maybe when you see self-wounding in performance next time, you might think like, but is it really, am I actually worried about their life? Or is that my justification for a worry that I've been taught? Because very often there's no, I mean, in my self-wounding, for example, like, it's super not dangerous, it's not painful, it's not very painful, it hurts less than stubbing my toe. I mean, so there's all these ways that we justify the way we think might be questioned, because maybe we're not thinking quite our own thoughts.
But there were cases.
Yes, there's
cases of death.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And there's, I think every case has its own distinction for sure. So thanks. That was like, it's quite a patchy rendering of the research that doesn't go into its depths at all, but I hope that it offers you something. Thanks for hanging on with me in this process, and let's have a beer, and I'm around to talk more if you want, and not if you don't want, and thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it. Thanks, guys.